We're really pleased to have Jeff Andrews with us, speaking on his new book, Radicals, the Working Classes and the Making of Modern Britain. I've actually read the book and I'd certainly recommend it. It's a great read and has actually a very different perspective on the Labour movement from, shall we say, many of the more traditional texts. So over to Jeff to speak. Jeff, I think, is going to speak for somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour. We'll see how it goes. And then there'll be time for questions. Please, can everybody mute their mics so we don't get any disturbance, feedback, or anything else horrible during Jeff's talk. At the end, there will be time for comments and questions. It's probably best if you don't fill the chat up while Jeff is speaking, because that can be a bit distracting for Jeff. So do save them for the time at the end after Jeff's speaking. So over to you, Jeff. Welcome.
Thanks, Duncan, and thanks, Steve, for invitation. And hello, everyone. Yeah, it's as Duncan was saying, it's taking probably a slightly different approach to some other histories of the Labour movement. I am Labour historian to some degree. I've written a book, History of the British Communist Party and New Left in the past, and recently political biographies. And so I've been thinking about the issues I discuss in the book for quite a long time. I should also say that, as we know, almost on a daily basis, some of the questions of concern have got quite recent interest. Not least what I think is a kind of existential crisis in the Labour Party. It's not a history of the Labour Party as such, but obviously that's quite a central part of the book. And I suppose my starting point really is that the working classes have become quite marginal in political discourse, and even to the Labour Party, the party it founded. But I would say central to the making of modern Britain, and that's really what I'm trying to rediscover, recapture, really. And not only as trade unionists, I'll talk in a minute about the general strike, and not only as politicians, but also as writers, as educators. Duncan mentioned adult education. There's quite a lot about that in the book. As interwar writers, the influence on George Orwell, for example, the dramatists of the late 1950s, early 1960s, the social movement activists, the alliance between feminism and the trade union movement into the 1970s. These are the radicals in the book. And I suppose then one of the themes of the book is agency. In other words, that the working classes are not sort of passive recipients of other people's politics and culture. They're active contributors to it. It won't surprise you to know that not among the radicals are spin doctors, Peter Mandelson, press secretaries, and so on. And I say that because if we look at recent evidence of the composition of the Labour Party in particular, we find that it's dominated by lobbyists and professional politicians. Though I noted that recently they've claimed they're the most working class cabinet. Indeed, the Labour Party, appropriately, I think on April the 1st, put out a statement from its Twitter account saying they were the most working class cabinet in British history. They're all university graduates, I believe, though presumably social history and sociology, not among the subjects they studied. And of course, we only have to think of leaders in the past. I've been reading the biography of Margaret Bonfield, I think the 10th child of 11, from a working class background, shop assistant. We know other Labour leaders have been lorry drivers, foundry workers, miners, and so on. National Health Service, given to us from a miner, the Foreign Secretary in the post-war government was a lorry driver, and so on. So one indication of a party that's in an existential crisis, I think, is not knowing your own history. So among other things, I hope the book will open up a discussion about Labour's history and what we can learn from it. I would also say that the working classes have been central to history of modern Britain, and the Labour movement itself has been based on what I'd call a historic alliance between the working classes and what might be called middle class progressives. And that alliance has been breaking down, or at least a shift in the balance between them. And that the breakdown of that alliance is also a contributory factor, I think, to the crisis It seems strange to say it's a crisis with a Labour government with a big majority, but the crisis, I think we can see it is. So I don't accept either that there's a binary, this relationship between the progressive middle classes and the working class is a division between, let's say, working class trade unionists and middle class intellectuals. I think that's far too simplistic. And I think the centrality of adult education, pulls that binary apart, really. That's a meeting point for workers, middle classes, and also ideas, generated from working class students and tutors. So I think ideas, art, culture have come from the working classes historically, and that's really important in what I'm going to say tonight. Obviously, the last week or so has reminded us of the general strike, a reminder really of the importance again of working class agency. There's been several books about the general strike that come out, very good books, I think, and a very good archive on Radio 4 a couple of weeks ago I thought was really good. And David Torrance opens his book on the general strike by comparing it to the lockdown under COVID, in the sense that the country had come to a halt to some extent, and that was the power, if you like, of working class action. And although it was a defeat that ended in a real sense of betrayal of the TUC and misery for the miners, nevertheless there are wider implications for that strike. I describe it in the book as a condition of England or a state of the nation moment, which brought together many different things. The questions it raised: in whose interests should industry serve? Who rules Britain? It made very clear how class divided British society was. Interestingly and revealingly, it was the first test for the new BBC. And of course, John Reith, who was then the managing director of the BBC, had to negotiate, in the end, not very successfully, between the competing interests. It was also a story about coal, obviously the centrality of coal in the nation's economy, also in its class structure within its communities. And as we know, it was the first and only time, really, when for 9 days at least, there was this battle. And it was called, TBC called it a national strike. And what's revealing to me, and very important, I think, is in very different types of communities, there was great solidarity, great capacity for self-organization, and demonstrating, I think, a very strong ethos, one which had been seen previously in Chartism and even earlier to some extent, a suspicion of a privileged elite, and the people who were on the receiving end of the decisions of that elite. And as far as class politics is concerned, I mean the Churchill's editing of the British Gazette, I would say, his ideological role in that, trying to get the BBC, in a sense, trying to commandeer the BBC, perceiving it as a threat to the Constitution. That's really where a lot of the class language came from. In fact, the TUC was quite cautious, of course, and saw it throughout as a constitutional strike. It was relatively free of violence, not entirely free of violence, but in comparison to other disputes of a similar nature in other countries, it was fairly moderate in that sense. It's radical in other senses. And obviously many leaders were arrested and suppressed in various ways, particularly communists. But I think for the left, it marked a moment where syndicalism, let's say the ideology which had preached workers' control, was very significant in just before the First World War and just after the First World War, was in decline. And in a sense, it was a battle that perhaps could never be won. But nevertheless, as I say, out of the defeat, many lessons, but stories of Britain in the 1920s, I think, were revealed. And one of the things I think that came out of that strike was the importance of ethos, this sense of being exploited, by a privileged elite and resistance to it. I think also there was extraordinary loyalty to each other. And as I say, very different parts of Britain, some with much stronger traditions of radicalism, South Wales miners or north of England, and in other places which didn't have the same traditions, managed to coexist. I think it was a radicalism that's evident in other aspects of the labour movement. I write quite a lot in the book about R.H. Tawney, who'd been on the Sankey Commission before the general strike, which of course had called for the nationalisation of the mines and various other improvements in the miners' struggle. And his kind of, and also I think 5 years before, he'd written a book, The Acquisitive Society, which was a moral, ethical critique of this corrosive capitalism, the way in which it devalued skills, knowledge, and experience of workers. And workers were reduced, to, if you like, to cogs in a machine. They were dehumanized. And I think the argument that the nation got hold of, at least part of it, was this sense, this very basic sense of fairness, not a minute on the day, not a penny off the pay, and so on. And I think it illustrates that in many ways that the this emphasis on what I call ethos in the book. There was a book written at the end of the 70s by Henry Drucker called Doctrine and Ethos in the Labour Party. It was a very limited book in many ways. I mean, it's a short book, and it was perhaps constrained by the debates in the Labour Party in that period. But I think he makes quite a good point, which is trying to understand the labour movement. If we look at it through the idea of ethos, not just through ideological orthodoxies, we learn more about it. And I think it also helps to explain why, in my view, this is something we might want to debate a bit later, why, in my view, the strand of socialism that's most durable in the British radical tradition is an ethical socialism. And I think you see it from Owenism, from the ideas of John Ruskin, obviously William Morris, Independent Labour Party, Blatchford's Merry England, the Christian socialism of R.H. Tawney. You see it also in Jenny Lee and Aaron Bevan, in what I call George Orwell's homemade socialism, and also in the New Left, particularly the first variant of the New Left, what's sometimes rather misleadingly called the Oxford London New Left, of Raphael Samuel and Stuart Hall. And I think, and actually you also see it to some extent in the Communist Party historians group. It's a kind of Marxism which has a strong ethical emphasis. I mean, Christopher Hill and E.P. Thompson, for example, brought up as Methodists. You can see their ethical socialism. It's there in the feminism of Sheila Rowbottom, who was influenced a lot by Edward Carpenter. So I think that ethical socialist tradition is more closely linked to ethos, and ethos, which puts a lot of emphasis on ethical values of community, fraternity, fellowship, and a very strong radical non-conformism, skepticism towards leaders. And of course, you get that in the general strike with the sense of betrayal at the end of it, and you've had it subsequently. Kind of loyalty on the one hand, but also skepticism when leaders are seen to pursue their own interests. And I think that their own self-interests, rather than the interests of the class or the movement as a whole. And I think you see parts of that even in today's politics, not just within the labour movement, but elsewhere. So I think that the general strike illustrated some of those themes. And as I say, agency being a very strong one. And I think that theme in the book, I develop a bit further beyond trade unionism and beyond politics. It's there, for example, if we look at the 1930s, the next decade. I mean, if the 1920s brought out some of these class divisions, revealed, the extent of class divisions, ended, of course, in defeat, which meant many of those divisions were intensified, particularly in trade union legislation. Also, a clash of what some historians call a clash of patriotisms. On the one hand, Churchill, very belligerent attempt to involve the middle classes in keeping the country going. On the other hand, within the working class communities and all those supporting the strike, a different kind of class patriotism, an alternative form, if you like, of class patriotism. And it's also interesting that within the traditions of ethical socialism, the notion of the nation is much more easily understood, I think, than in later versions of socialism. But if we go to the 1930s, this decade when the middle classes are trying to discover working class conditions, the literary tourists traveling to the north of England, and J.B. Priestley and others, including, of course, George Orwell, and the mass observation surveys in Bolton, in Worktown. And again, the starting point for the four historians, well, four investigators, let's say, the mixture of, photographer, whole mixture of art and culture, but their starting assumption of going to Bolton was really to try and find out how the other half lived, and not surprising that there were anthropologists among them, and there was still that ignorance, really, of what working classes were like, what they believed in, and I think it's really important when looking at the development of George Orwell's socialism that he owes a lot to two working class writers, Jack Hilton and Jack Comyn, and I write about their contributions in the book. Originally, Orwell was going to go to Rochdale, which is where Jack Hilton's home was. And Hilton told him to go to Wigan because he got a better sense of mining community, unemployment, and so on. And Hilton, who was this, his book Caliban Shrieks was rediscovered a couple of years ago by a Manchester barista who saw it in the Working Class Movement Library in Salford. He wrote that book. His WA tutor recommended he apply to Ruskin College. He went to Ruskin. It's a very interesting account of his interview at Ruskin, which is in his papers in Nottingham, where he is very skeptical towards their questioning. He's very determined to explain that he's not going to end up as a Labour apparatchik, and he's committed to his writing. And this book was very influential at the time, and Orwell had reviewed it and befriended Hilton. And Hilton said, go to Wigan. Orwell came back, as you know, with this account of not knowing anything really about the working class. He'd been studying the homeless in London and Paris, but his first two novels were about the crisis in middle class identity, really, A Clergyman's Daughter and Keep the Aspidistra Flying. And he knew nothing about the industrial working class. And I think he got a lot from Hilton about, Hilton and Jack Comyn, the other writer who befriended Orwell this time, have both written one of the early, I suppose, generation of working class writers, along with a whole list of some of them who'd come out of actually the general strike, and they taught him, I think, about not only working class living conditions and the journal. It was very interesting. The journal they were involved in, the Adelphi, had this division of labour where the middle class intellectuals would write about socialist theory, and the working class writers would write about conditions. And again, it's this sort of false binary, because what Hilton and Comyn taught Orwell was also about culture, about life, about socialism as it meant to their communities. They lived among communities, among the labour movement, not just among intellectuals. And I think if you look at the development of George Orwell's socialism, what I call homemade socialism, a sort of British ethical socialism, he draws a lot on their ideas, and I think their contribution hasn't been fully recognised. So that's one thing I wanted to do in the book. And then the following decade, the decade of the late 1950s into the 1960s, saw again, I think, in similar ways, a contribution to culture from working class dramatists. It's quite interesting that Bill Norton, who was driving the lorry of the mass observation, map of the mass observers, who was actually a respondent in that mass observation study in the 1930s in Bolton, was himself a significant playwright from the late 50s to the 1960s, whose play Alfie, later a film with Michael Caine and various other things, was groundbreaking. Sheila Delaney's A Taste of Honey was also incredibly innovative at the time, a young working class woman writing about living life and culture that was unknown still in many ways to middle class audiences, putting on the on the agenda, but bringing to the drama to the early TV screens later in the 60s. Dennis Potter, who'd been a contemporary of the New Left in Oxford, his early plays based on his mining community in the Forest of Dean, his early the plays of Nigel Barton, recounting his experience as a Labour Party candidate in 1964. All these dramatists and writers were opening up the country to they were right at the centre of Britain's developing modern culture, and I think it's important to recognise that. And I would also say probably, I mean, there's a case for saying that we had a lot of emphasis is on 1968 as the moment of student revolution, which changed the left, a sort of different variant of the New Left. And as we know, in Britain, it wasn't as significant as it was in Paris or in Italy in 1969 in the hot autumn. And I would argue that the late 50s, you could say 58 if you like, but 57 to 1960 was a more radical period in many ways, or at least a more groundbreaking period. If you think that obviously after 56, the New Left is born, Raymond Williams' Culture and Society, Richard Hoggart's The Uses of Literacy, Sheila Delaney, Michael Young, another thinker I talk about in the book, The Rise of the Meritocracy. All these works were produced in that period. And in the case of Sheila Delaney, for example, she prefigured a lot of the debates around, the debates taken up by the women's liberation movement in the following decade. I think they were groundbreaking and to some extent, something we might want to debate, more culturally significant than 1968 events. And I would say that the most significant event of spring 1968 was not the student movement in Britain I'm talking about, but the Ford's strike, the women machinists at Ford's, who, one of the most significant strikes led by women. And I think what was interesting about that was the convergence in the aftermath of that, and other strikes took place of that which was, challenging not only the nature of the harsh conditions of the employers, but to some extent challenging the labour movement traditions, because it was male trade unionists who'd agreed on the unequal grading scheme that the workers were protesting against. And there was this really interesting, I think, convergence between that and the women's liberation movement. And it was quite revealing, I think, that the first Women's Liberation Movement conference took place at Ruskin and came out of a history workshop, a series of history workshop events. History workshop set up in 1967, and a group of women, Sally Alexander and Sheila Rowbottom and others, and other people who attended this, I think it was a conference on education, were planning a meeting for the following year. And instead of, I think it was a possibility of organising something on the conditions of 19th century women, they wanted a meeting on the contemporary issues facing women. And so the Women's Liberation Movement conference took place at Ruskin. I think the college was slightly surprised by the attendance. And in fact, they had to relocate to the Oxford Union, which in itself was a challenge, if you like, to the bastions of male privilege. And of course, in that coming together of trade unionists and feminists and the resulting legislation on equal pay, on sex discrimination, on domestic violence, the most significant social movement of modern times. And I think, the Labour movement was in the centre of that. And then, as the book develops, I get more pessimistic, I have to say. And we're in quite pessimistic times now. And obviously, in the 1980s, with Thatcherism, was a period of defeat in many cases for the left. I mean, I also say that I was at Ruskin during the 84-85 miners' strike, and again, I would say that strike, another strike that wasn't won, but did demonstrate the kind of ethos I described earlier, and not only that, but bringing in new groups in the way in which perhaps feminism had done in the earlier decade, bringing together new social movements in defence of communities. Towards the end of the book, I have a section I call unmaking, an epilogue of unmaking, where I try and it's something which is, unfinished, obviously, looking at the situation we're in now. I try to explain what has happened, what has happened to the working classes, why they're not more central within the labour movement. I mean, one thing to say is that the labour movement itself is a term that's rarely explained properly or understood, and of course is much more limited, because the labour movement traditionally includes also the cooperative movement. It includes sections of adult education, and is not so narrowly defined. But if you look at the composition of, for example, Labour Party, you see them now dominated by lobbyists and professionals. And in the 1945-51 government, of the Labour MPs elected, a very strong proportion of them were either people who had taught, who had studied within adult education. As Duncan said at the beginning, adult education is quite a strong part of this book. I think Clement Attlee once said, no doubt exaggerating, that the reason why the Labour Party won the 45 election was because of the WEA and the forces education system during the war. What it at least says is that is this kind of combination of a sort of search for intellectual cultural freedom married with the need for social and political change. And of all the thinkers I describe in the book, I think they've all got a link to adult education. And I think that the decline of the labour movement, one part of that is a crucial part of that, I would argue, is the decline of adult education, that those institutions no longer have the kind of influence. That's a mixture of Labour and Tory policy. I mean, the Blair government had to increase university entrance for 18-year-olds. We were way behind, very few people going on to higher education. But I think one of the costs of that was, the lack of funding then going to adult education institutions. I start the book, Duncan mentioned Thomas Wright earlier on, who was an autodidact, and I start the book rediscovering him. He was, his first writings were under the pseudonym The Journeyman Engineer. I looked for his grave about 5 or 10 years ago now, I remember, in South London, and couldn't find it. There's no known photograph of it. When he was writing as an iron turner between 1867, that's the year of the Second Reform Act, and 1873, he wrote 4 non-fiction books, 2 working class novels, and an autobiographical account of his early years while working as an iron turner. Now, he won the admiration of the middle class journals who published him, and also Charles Dickens and Matthew Arnold, among others, who praised his work. Now, his work was not only about the habits and customs of the working classes, not only about the conditions of work that he encountered, they also had very insightful political analysis of the need, for example, for a working class political party. He was very pro-Paris Commune without being a communist. And some of his most distinctive writing was about culture, observing, writing about culture at a time when literacy, the links between literacy and democracy were very important. Now, for the left, he's been described as in a sense, archetypal Labour aristocrat in Eric Hobsbawm's study of the Labour aristocracy, and in subsequent the PhD students of Hobsbawm. And I think it's a very unfair representation of him. And in a way, I mean, I'm a great admirer of Hobsbawm and influenced me in many ways. But on this, I think he's got it wrong. I mean, he put together this analysis in his sort of earlier years when he was on the Communist Party Historians Group. But I think it illustrates the problem of seeing workers in such a limited way. In other words, reducing them to their working conditions. I mean, Thomas Wright was an early member of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, so we do get a sense of his work as a trade unionist. but he was also writing about politics from his own first-hand experience. He brought great knowledge and insight to that. And he wrote about culture in a way that, in effect, knowing the uses of literacy 70 years before Richard Hoggart, for example, was writing about that. So in rediscovering Thomas Wright, I'm trying to put this working class tradition, trying to recenter this working class tradition within, if you like, a more cultural, artistic, intellectual current than is often the case. And in the early chapters of the book, I discuss adult education in more depth. For example, the Working Men's College that John Ruskin taught at, the University Extension College, where Oxford and Cambridge sent lecturers to industrial districts. By no means a kind of top-down experience, because if the workers who'd spend all their days, down the pit or in that factory or whatever, weren't happy with the lecturers, they would have not be timid in giving their giving their feedback. I've been looking at some of the documents, and then of course Ruskin College, 1899, founded by two Americans, young Americans actually, Charles Beard and Walter Ruhlman, who were in their 20s, influenced a lot by Ruskin. And it's quite interesting that in the first cohort of Labour MPs elected in 1906, there's this very interesting survey of their favourite authors, which is quite revealing in many ways. But John Ruskin is top of this list. And I think the reason why Ruskin is so popular, if you like, among working class trade unionists and early socialists is that he understood that skilled workers, for example, made this great contribution, their knowledge and experience, but they didn't get the reward their labour deserved. And I think that struck a chord with and was inspiring. And the other authors that they identify, Dickens, Shakespeare, the Bible. Interestingly, Giuseppe Mazzini, the Italian Democrat who met the Chartists, but there's no Marx, because people aren't, hasn't been translated into English. There's no William Morris either, and there aren't really Fabians, although the Webbs had just written their history of trade unionism. So I think that certainly for that cohort of Labour MPs, all of whom left school before their teenage years, and they may not have been typical of the workers, but they were, if you like, the aspiring leaders of that movement. And that was the initial purpose of Ruskin in the eyes of the founders, that they would go on and play this leading role, that the working classes would have their own leaders, if you like, their own statesmen, if you like. And then, of course, the Workers' Education Association, the first part of the 20th century, again, R.H. Tawney, founded by Albert Mansbridge, but R.H. Tawney was probably one of its leading proponents. And it's very interesting that Tawney, who's probably the socialist I write about the most in the book, who I think is probably, as an ethical socialist, the closest to that tradition I've described. He learned a lot from his students in the labour unrest before the First World War, for example. You can see in his Commonplace book. And it was very much a kind of democratic relationship. I mean, on the one hand, they admired him for his knowledge. He took from them, their life experience. And actually, he installed in Oxford one of his, one of his protégés, Cartwright, who is this coordinator of the industrial classes of the WA and the tutorial colleges, and would bring them to Oxford for the summer schools. And I also think that Hillcroft College, which was set up after the First World War as a kind of Ruskin college for women, because Ruskin didn't take women at that point, or they did after the just after the First World War. But Hillcroft was a college for working class women, if you like, bringing together the demands for suffrage with the demands for education together. And then subsequently, of course, we've had the extramural classes. I mean, there were more people studying with the WA in the 1920s than all the conventional universities put together. And I think the extramural traditions carried on. And I have a chapter in the book also about the Open University, the early years of the Open University, where I'm still a tutor, a very different place. Owed a lot to Jenny Lee. I see there's now a statue outside Milton Keynes Station of Jenny Lee, a bit late, like the trains, because she died in 1988, and it's taken them that long to put up a statue. But she had to battle with Tony Crossland and others in the cabinet, supported by Wilson. And the university, of course, was groundbreaking. I mean, another achievement by the Labour government. Quite interesting that Jenny Lee, the University, and Aaron Bevan, the National Health Service, the two of them making those contributions. The two of them as well, I would say, I put within this ethical socialist tradition. And Aaron Bevan was a kind of mixture of a kind of homemade Marxism and a Democrat and a parliamentarian. But again, the arguments they use, I think, very much fall within this ethical tradition. Of course, what was radical about the Open University was its relationship with the BBC, the University of the Air, and what they did in the early years. And I think this owes a lot to Jenny Lee and also to a enterprising first Vice Chancellor, Walter Perry, who managed to get Peter Montagnon, who'd directed the Kenneth Clark's Civilization series in the late 60s, as the first head of OU broadcast. And that link meant that you could obviously bring education to the living rooms of the people, describe it as the People's University, and attracted a lot of interesting dissidents, because when the OU was set up, there was a lot of snobbery from other universities who didn't see it as a real university, and a reluctance from academics in those universities, to give up a career and start with a new experiment. And of course, the OU got its charter in 1969, but in 1970, there was a Tory government, many of whom were very sceptical about the OU. So its future was never certain. Apparently, Mrs. Thatcher was reasonably supportive of the OU because it fitted her idea of a sort of self-help and self-improvement. But in the early years, it was quite precarious. And so they recruited a real interesting mixture. The first professor of arts was Arnold Kettle, that some of you will remember from the Communist Party Culture Committee and as an intellectual in the Communist Party, who had a kind of renaissance, really, in that period. I mean, he threw himself into the work of the OU. He moved near the campus, worked a lot with others on the left, including some on the New Left, who he'd originally been quite suspicious of. They came together, produced these great courses. There were victims of McCarthyism who taught at the OU. There were people who'd left apartheid South Africa who came. And so they recruited this really interesting group of dissidents, with an entirely new idea of a university. And they also attracted intellectuals of the caliber of Alistair Clare, who I describe in the book, who was at Oxford, regarded as sort of heir to Isaiah Berlin, but went on this journey of being a novelist and a writer, a columnist in The Guardian and elsewhere, and a TV presenter, but also a producer of many of the OU's arts courses. So I think this adult education tradition is really strong, and throughout the book, right from the beginning really to the more difficult period at the end, I form a link, often through some of the thinkers, all of whom in different ways contributed to adult education. John Ruskin, R.H. Tawney, Richard Hoggart, of course, Raymond Williams, who was a staff tutor in the Oxford Extramural Department, E.P. Thompson, whose The Making of the English Working Class was influenced a lot by his extramural classes in Yorkshire. They were the unofficial sources who helped him with that book. Stuart Hall, later Professor of Sociology at the University, was at the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, quite a lot about Raphael Samuel, who was, of course, the founder of the History Workshop. Was also my tutor. Was the founder as well of the New Left in its first variant. Really interesting figure. He died 30 years ago. This year, we might want to talk about his contribution. And of course, Sheila Rowbottom, Eric Hobsbawm was at Birkbeck. And the list seems to be endless. And it strikes me that the gap, the missing element of the Labour movement, there are many actually, but the decline of adult education really tells a wider story. And so I suppose my voice is running out, so I'm going to come to an end. But I had a kind of personal interest in doing the book. I was like most of my contemporaries. I failed my 11 plus, went to work for the post office, got involved in a trade union, did an open university course, went to Ruskin in the 1980s. And I thought, without Labour movement, I probably wouldn't have had any education, certainly not the education that I had in the end, very unconventional by today's standards, because Ruskin is still survives, but it's a very different kind of place. So there was a personal interest in the book, but also a kind of, I'm not a member of the Labour Party, but obviously, like probably most people here, look at it with a mixture of incredulity and sorrow and whatever other words one used to describe it. But I end the book with this question. It seems to be more relevant than ever in the last days or even hours of the shenanigans within the Labour government. The critical question for Labour, capital L, is not whether the party has a socialist doctrine or not, and many of us wish that it would, but if it is any longer the party of Labour, small l, and whether the talents, skills and experiences of the people it was founded to represent still matter. And I'll end at that point.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Excellent summary, and obviously right at the end, raising the key question of the day for many of us. But open to people to ask questions or comments to which Jeff can reply. So please use the reactions button and put your hand up, and then I can actually see you because you'll come to the front of the queue. So who wants to go first? Right. All right. Martin Childs, you need to unmute.
Yes, I suppose my question is, where do we go from here? You can hear me now, can you?
Yes.
Oh, good. I've been interested in what Richard Wolff has been writing in America about democracy at work. I wonder if democracy itself is a key to working class going forward in the way of workers' cooperatives, instead of state socialism. He makes the point that that should be emphasised and could be the future for the working people. Otherwise, we seem to be locked in a situation. We have trade unions taking on the management, and it's an endless thing, isn't it? We don't see any end in sight for the working people's empowerment. And I wonder if although it might be a more gradual thing, bottom up, the gradual growth of workers' co-ops might be a way forward. That wasn't mentioned this evening. Another interesting thing I think might be missed out was the growth of Euro-communism and its influence, that we had the Italian Communist Party with Enrico Berlinguer. It certainly influenced me and its beliefs, and it's coming to Marxism from that direction. So, I'd like to have some comments on that. I was a bit muddled.
Thanks, Martin. Jeff, do you want to respond?
Yeah, just on the last point, Berlinguer was a big influence on me as well, and along with Gramsci and stimulated my interest in Italy. Just on the first point, I think you're right. I mean, this debate going on at the moment. I mean, the trade unions may still have a strong part to play in the whatever happens in the Labour leadership, and of course, the trade union relationship with the Labour Party has changed because of the post-industrialization and all those changes in the nature of work. So the unions that are strong now have a different relationship to some extent than the unions of the past. But I noticed, in the last few days that trade union leaders have spoken up about the crisis in the Labour Party. But certainly cooperation was crucial in the Labour movement and the women's cooperative movement, for example. And that was crucial, I would say, to the ethos of the Labour movement, along with other things, including friendly societies and forms of mutualism. So yeah, if we could rediscover that tradition, and I do think that although the Fabian Society remains interesting with individuals and so on, what we understand as Fabianism, I think, has always been overplayed in the history of the Labour movement. I think the working class ethos that I described earlier, this kind of non-conformism, one part of that non-conformism, obviously there's a religious non-conformism, but more widely is this skepticism. I mean, the British working classes, the radical tradition don't like orthodoxies particularly, and also vanguards, whether political vanguards or intellectual vanguards. And I think that's I suppose when I was focusing on agency, that was one of the things I was trying to challenge.
Thanks. Roger Tanner, you're next.
Yeah, I've been very good and really interesting talk, and it's made me want to rush out now and get the book. But just to say that I've been spending a lot of time recently in the context of doing studies about the general strike in Nottingham, where I come from, and the work, the role of independent working class education through the Plebs League, breaking from Ruskin, and then from the work of the National Council for Labour Colleges and so on. That whole argument about the working class being the people who are going to lead and create their own education, which probably comes from the syndicalist movement. I mean, I'm wondering how far that is brought out in your book, because your emphasis is very much on the WEA, which many in the Plebs League and the independent working class organisations, the Central Labour College and so on, saw as the enemy at several stages in the 20s.
Well spotted. Yes, I mean, I do discuss that. I discussed the Ruskin strike, well, it's difficult to. I mean, I do. There was this dispute. I mean, I think that the Ruskin strike, in a way, overshadowed a lot of things that were going on. I mean, I admire Stuart McIntyre's book on this and Jonathan Ray's book, but it was talking about a particular kind of Marxist education, and I don't know how to describe this. I mean, a lot of that was, I think, of its time. I mean, the syndicalism came from Noah Ablett at Ruskin and was obviously strong in that period, just before the First World War, just after. It subsequently declined, and I think that I would put it bluntly. I have a problem with the way they use the term independent working class education, because a lot of the autodidacts, a lot of the WA, the Tawny heritage was also, if you like, independent working class education. I mean, it may have been. It may have been in more conventional settings, but a lot of the tutors in the Central Labour College were middle class, for example. Aaron Bevan was a student at the Central Labour College, and he thought the teacher was too rigid, and went to London to enjoy the cultural life of London. So I was a Ruskin, which was carried on, and I did a whole term on Marxism. I mean, I think that I think there were legitimate complaints which partly led to the strike about the teaching of Marxism by the existing Ruskin College staff who hadn't read Marx. I think they were quite legitimate. But I also think that what happened subsequently was a very narrow concept of education. A lot of it, I think, was preparing workers for the class struggle. But we know from Jonathan Rose's book, this great book, The Intellectual Life of the British Working Classes, this aspiration for study was much wider than that. And so, yeah, I come down on the side of the of Ruskin and the WEA, but you'll have to read and write to me and argue with the book.
Yeah, thanks. The discussion on that in the book is fascinating, I have to say. Steve Cushion, you're next.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for. I think we need to rescue R.H. Tawney. I've just discovered his the agrarian problem in the 16th century, which I mean I think is great at explaining the enclosures and the start of that movement and the class struggle in those days, which brings me to wonder, where does the class struggle fit into what you're saying? I mean, I know you were talking about 1968 wasn't very important in Britain. In a lot of ways, it wasn't. But 1972 to 1974, the two miners' strikes, the campaign about the dockers, the way the print workers came out in support of the arrested dockers, all of that, the big building workers' strike, really kind of, for me, paved the way for what I remember as probably the best time of my life as a London bus driver, when we were earning good money. But there was also, I think, what in that there's something that very recently I was visiting a friend, and his daughter came round. His daughter was, this is 2 or 3 years ago now, his daughter was an air steward for British Airways. Oh, hello, I said, I hear you've been on strike. What's it about? And she said, well, we said it was about the money, but actually it's because we hate the bastards. So I wonder if you'd like to make a comment about that sort of aspect of it.
Thanks. Yeah, I do write about those strikes, and I've written about it before, which is probably why I didn't include it in the talk. But yeah, there was a remarkable period. I mean, a lot of those disputes, of course, unprecedented numbers of strike days, and very radical, and indeed brought down a Tory government. And key figure, of course, was Bert Ramilson, who was a remarkable organizer, had a remarkable life, of course. And it's interesting, you mentioned Tawney, because particularly in his early years, he one of his big arguments about the first couple of Labour governments, the ones that the first one, and then the minority, and then the Ramsay, what happened with Ramsay MacDonald. He said the problem facing the Labour movement was its lack of a philosophy. They didn't know what to do with the economy, didn't have there wasn't enough coherence in their approach to win over, if you like, Gramscian terms, to be hegemonic, whatever. And that was a point made by somebody mentioned Eurocommunism. That was made by the group of young, quite radical Eurocommunists in the 1970s who were on the economics committee with Bert Ramilson, who argued that, yes, there's this militancy. Where's it going to lead us? What comes after it? And, I think Tawney had died, of course, long before that. But had he been around, he might have asked the same question, is that how do you translate this, the grievances of the workers, justified grievances, and all the active, how do you sort of build a philosophy around it? And one attempt was made, of course, and Jack Jones had that idea with the social contract. But of course, that became, in the end, just a sort of, and the original idea for the social contract was much more interesting. It was partly influenced, I think, it had some parallel with what was going on in Italy, but the idea that you have a sort of, you have a quid pro quo between workers' demands and other social benefits and reforms. And in theory, that was the way in which the unions and the social movements would come together. Now, that didn't happen in reality, or it happened in some cases, but not in other cases. And of course, there were lots of interesting ideas like the Lucas Aerospace initiatives and various things. But at the end of the day, the militancy wasn't matched with the kind of political understanding of what was needed. And I think that was why it was followed by Thatcherism, and by this kind of long-standing period of decline for the Labour movement. The optimism of the early 70s, if you compare that with the pessimism of the late 70s, what's gone on in that period.
Thanks. James Crosley, you're next.
Thanks, Jeff. I look forward to reading the book, which I will do very soon. I have a question on religion that you raised a couple of times there. And I think you mentioned something about the Bible alongside Shakespeare as being a cultural resource, and you mentioned nonconformity. And obviously, these have had quite significant influences on the labour movement, on socialism, and so on. But there's also a tension, isn't there? I mean, there's a militant anti-religion and hostility towards
Yeah,
the Bible as well,
yeah.
and even towards non-conforms. And then there's just cultural embarrassment, I think, the further you get into the 20th century. How does that tension play out in some of the stuff you study? Do you know?
Yeah, well, it's good. It's a good question, and obviously, the whole list of early Labour MPs, Methodists, or other. I mean, examples of Arthur Henderson, or the whole list of them, when religion was very important. I have a chapter on the ragged trouser philanthropists, and again, it's something that you might want to debate. But I question why this book, interesting as it is, and not least for the kind of the sort of first-hand experience in turning into that story. But I question why it's seen as a quote Bible of the British left in many ways. And of course, that has the author has precisely the kind of antipathy towards religion that you describe. And Raphael Samuel describes it. I mean, there's also this counter. Stephen Yeo and others have written about the religion of socialism going on, in the sort of 1880s and afterwards. And of course, in the Ragged Trouser Philanthropists, you see that critique of religion on the one hand, as the opium of the people or whatever, and on the other hand, you see the protagonists as this what Raphael Samuel calls a minority elect, who are kind of performing almost a kind of religious role in a sort of in a non-Christian way, if you like, who would bring socialism from the outside and convert people. I mean, it was about converting people, crusades to convert people, if not, and of course, a lot of some more radical socialists had earlier been religious. I mean, the radical principal of Ruskin College, who went with the strikers, somebody called Dennis Hurd, had previously been a leading Church of England representative. And so it's a very interesting contrast as you describe it. And I think there is this, as I say, I think one of the we can debate one of the problems with Tressel's book, apart from the fact there are some anomalies with his background and go into his biography, but he was he stayed with the Heinemann faction, the Social Democratic Federation, and he is clearly distanced and either unimpressed or lacking any engagement with the kind of social changes that are going on in the period he's writing the book, and the liberal reforms of Edwardian liberalism and the early Labour MPs. And he has sort of no interest in that. And so, ironically, I think in this antagonism towards religion, there is a kind of, if you like, religious strand to it, which is that that you're converting people to socialism through, I would probably more than propaganda, but it was a kind of crusade, and in a way, those tensions, you could say, between a more reformist ethical socialism and that more radical socialism, religion is a way of telling that story.
Okay, Graham Taylor.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say that I have read the book, and it's a great book, and it's full of interesting original points. So everybody should read it. Second point is that I find there's a lack of differentiation when there's talk of ethical socialism. The ethical socialism of the ILP is not the same as the ethical socialism of Tawney, and it's not the same as the ethical socialism of Blue Labour. So you have a continuum of ethical socialisms there, which have to be distinguished from each other. And I think that the reason why you have different ethical socialisms is because there were different types of working class. So the working class is talked about as if it was one thing over the last 200 years. But in fact, it was differently constituted. So if you're talking about 1926 and the general strike, before that, there was an artisan radicalism in the early 19th century. And then there was a sort of what I call dispersed industrial working class in the late 19th century, thinking of mills and isolated factories. And then from sort of 1926 to 86, you've got a more concentrated workforce, sometimes called Fordism in some texts. And then after that, you've got the sort of shattered working class, which we have today, which is sort of half slum proletariat or half underclass compared to what it was before. And I think each of those working classes has got a different ethic, a different ethical socialism. So, for example, the ethical socialism of Lansbury and the ILP was very individualistic, I'd say Protestant. It talked in terms of conscience. Whereas the Tawney's one, which was later, was collective. I think Jeff mentioned community, fellowship, and loyalty. So I'd like to know what Jeff's commentary is on that, whether this differentiation is valid in his opinion.
Thanks very much, Graham. A very challenging question there, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks. And I do agree with Graham that I mean, this, I've used a very broad category of ethical socialism, and indeed differences and tensions and in fact arguments between them. You can pick out several of the people I mentioned who would be on different sides of various debates. So I mean, so in a way, it's quite a convenient. My use of it is quite convenient, I suppose, for the argument of the book. However, I do think that if you think of it like that, then some of the debates about the left more easily understood, I think. And it's quite interesting to, for example, to see the transition in Raphael Samuel's politics from being a very precocious, young person, student from on his mother's side, Jewish communist background. And then he's at Oxford in at the time of, when 1956 or just before that, actually, at Balliol, where Christopher Hill he knew from he's already a member of the Communist Party Historians Group when he was still at school, I believe. So, and then the aftermath of that on him, I mean, a completely different. I mean, he had at one point, I think, some kind of a breakdown not long after that. But he, from galvanizing, on the half of the party, and then going to the New Left, and for a while working, I think, with Michael Young on his family and kinship in East London, then, and all those changes. And you see in the 1980s this passionate defense of Raphael Samuel of R.H. Tawney, when the Social Democrats, actually, ironically, Michael Young, I think, was behind it, were trying to claim Tawney through their Tawney Society. And you see in his development, still committed to Marxism, but also, a very strong ethical strand. So I do think, there certainly is not one ethical socialism. And I think the class differences that Graham mentioned are important, as are the different political trajectories, I think, also important. So, but I suppose my point is that if you think of it in those terms, and away from the sort of Fabianism or utilitarianism or the top-down rigid forms of Marxism, then at least you're shifting the debate onto, how on the kind of moral questions of the day, the humanism of the post-56. Excuse me. Edward Thompson, in his biography of William Morris in the first edition, was saying that Morris's factory of the future already in the Soviet Union. A couple of years later, he's arguing with party bosses and rediscovering socialist humanism. So I think both the class factions and the political factions, if you like, are significant in that story.
Thanks. John Clemmer, you're next. You need to unmute. Yep.
Hello.
We can't really hear you.
Excuse
Your mic is in
if
a...
access.
No, John, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. You've got problems with your mic. If you want to put your point in the chat while I take somebody else. Does anybody else want to come in?
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, that's better, John. Okay, yeah.
No,
it's not John. Okay, who's speaking?
hear me?
No, sorry, John, we can't hear you at all.
Yes.
Right. Has anybody else got a comment or a question? I know Jeff's voice is beginning to go, so last chance, I think, for anybody.
Can hear me?
No, we still can't hear you, John. Sorry.
It's John. Can you hear me?
Right. If I can just sort of ask one sort of final point, which is, I suppose, a question almost for another book, is I don't know whether Jeff wants to comment, I mean, in the light of his sort of final comments in his talk, about, to what extent the sort of move away from the Labour Party, from its more working class base, has impacted both on its policies and its ethos, even if it's got an ethos, in a time when basically reform effectively has become the party of the residual working class.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. Yeah, well, I sort of come back to the point I made earlier that Labour not knowing its own history, and I suppose if you look at its strongholds now compared to its heartlands, the political geography has changed a lot, and I don't think that's just changes in the nature of the working class, which is obviously quite significant. I think that Labour, one of the problems it's got is now, if I mention go back to the sort of ethos, where one part of that is this skepticism towards orthodoxies and elites, privileged elites, and so on, is that Labour's now itself regarded by many as a sort of progressive elite, if you like, and so that balance you had before between the progressive middle classes and its working class base has clearly been disrupted, even though we're talking about a Labour government now in power. And obviously, on the one hand, people are going to the Greens or whatever. On the other hand, they're going to reform. Look at the result in Wales. So they're also going to Plaid Cymru. So re-establishing that balance, in a progressive bloc. Now, people were saying that the only answer now is a kind of progressive alliance, various versions we had in the past of the broad democratic alliance, I remember, and other things. But what I would, and many of my sort of older friends talk about this, but one problem I have with that, I think, coming back to Duncan's question, is if it's going to be more than an electoral alliance, a progressive alliance, you need a consensus on what you mean by progressive. And I don't think there is such a consensus. And there are big disputes on all kinds of things, quite significant big questions that there isn't this consensus. So I don't know. The working class base of the Labour movement is, is changed. We saw last week all kinds of areas, working class areas that no longer voting Labour. I think if this is going to be a by-election now that Andy Burnham is fighting in an area where he's very strong, but also Reform won a lot of votes last week. That actually could be an interesting test for these wider questions, whatever it means to the Labour Party. And this is a kind of test whether the Labour Party can win over those, can in a period of kind of crisis, whether it can win back those votes. So it may have a wider significance than just about the Labour Party.
Right, so this is time for us all to get involved in action and discussion. I think that's fair to say. Get over our depression. Right, John Clemo has just put his question in the chat, so I'll read it out. Gramsci saw trade unions as reformist as opposed to revolutionary and bureaucratic. Strikes were schools of revolution as well as the means to take control of working conditions and wages. In 2026, there is no experience of this kind, no model for change, no school of revolution. Where do we get this fellowship from today?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I agree, and it's difficult. There's also, I mean, the early writings of Gramsci's own involvement, of course, in those post World War One factory occupations, obviously really significant. And it's also frustratingly for those of us who were influenced a lot by Gramsci, that in Britain, where there was a lot of interest in Gramsci in the 80s, it was more a question of just of understanding. It had more influence in understanding the right than in actually influencing the strategies of the left. And I think that was always a problem, for the British Euro-communist tradition. It was good on critique, but weaker on solutions. And I think we've suffered from that as well.
Right, thanks, Jeff. Any final comments? Because I can't see anybody else wanting to come in. Can I just say that we have put, or Steve Cushion has put in the chat, the discount code for getting the book slightly more than market price at 26 SPR. So the link is in the chat and the code is there, right? And that's the book. Okay, any final comments, Jeff?
No, thanks. Really good questions, quite tough questions. So thanks. It's an interesting discussion. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Jeff. So if we can thank Jeff as usual. Thank you. I also want to make just a couple of announcements about the forthcoming events for the Socialist History Society. We do have these regular on talks, normally about one a month, but we've got two coming up in June. Deborah Parish is going to talk about prophets and witches, witchcraft, gender and politics in revolutionary England on the 2nd of June. And that has now been, I think, put back from our normal time of 7 o'clock to 8 p.m. Because Deborah is on the other side of the world, so in a slightly different time zone, and we'll be doing it, I think, in the middle of the night. And then our AGM will be a face-to-face AGM, as we always have now, while everything else is online. That will be on Saturday, the 6th of June, the AGM at 1 p.m. at the Marx Memorial Library. Which will be followed by Donald Sassoon talking on his new book, Revolutions: A New History. So I hope we'll see you online at the first session and face-to-face at the following session. Many of you are members of the Socialist History Society. You will have received this week our latest newsletter and our occasional publication reprinting two papers on the general strike in Brighton, edited by our committee member Christian Husberg. If you join the Socialist History Society, you do get a couple of occasional publications, a couple of newsletters, normally a year, and Socialist History Society, our peer-reviewed, I say semi-academic or academic journal, depending on what you think of our articles. So another issue is in preparation and will be out very soon. So there you are, how to join the Socialist History Society. Please do join. We want a lot more of our members actually involved in writing for us, writing publications, reviews for the newsletter, telling us what research they're doing. This is a membership participation organisation, And clearly, the fact that we do everything online for free, or most things online for free, doesn't really act as an incentive to paying a subscription and to member participation. So, those of you that are piggybacking on us, please join and participate. We also need to know what you're all up to and writing about. You don't need to be an academic, just somebody who's actually interested and active in the world of socialist history. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you especially to Jeff, and hope to see you soon. And do get Jeff's book. As I said at the beginning, it is really well worth reading, and actually much better than a lot of, should we say, writing on so-called socialist history. So thank you very much, Jeff.